Alright, so we're looking at some more fallacies, and let you remember last class I divided fallacies up into a bunch of different families. The things that we're looking at today don't actually fit into any families of fallacies. They're kind of standalone, and so we're tidying up a little bit, you might say. One of the ones that we're going to look at first, two wrongs make a right, you could see as connected with the ad hominem or genetic fallacy, in that sort of family where you're trying to disqualify somebody and then thereby disqualify their claim. But it's got a particular structure to it, and that's why I think your book treats it as something separate. So let's start with that. You guys have all heard two wrongs don't make a right, right? Well, why do we have a fallacy that in fact asserts that? Two wrongs make a right. Well, because people do make these kind of arguments all the time. And I think you're going to find as we go through this that you've made those sort of arguments. I know I've made those sort of arguments. They're just not good arguments because they're bringing up things that are actually irrelevant to the point that's being discussed. So let's think, for example, of some political arguments. A lot of arguments in politics made like this. Somebody will say, well, they did it to us first, so it's okay for us to do it to them. For example, I considered it a very bad sign in the Bush years when I saw how the Senate Democrats were blocking a lot of things. They were doing what was called filibustering. And I saw that as a bad sign, not because I had anything against the Democrats, but because if one side starts to do something like that, what do you think the other side is going to do when they're in the opposition? They're going to do the same thing. Once you open up the door to that sort of thing, the way it works in politics, once you sort of raise the bar, you raise the level of antagonism, both sides are going to do the same thing. And they're both going to appeal to this principle. So the Senate Republicans, when they were being criticized for filibustering some of Obama's things, or when they're talking about defunding his health care. The Democrats had talked about defunding something a while back when Bush was the president. They were going to defund the war, right? If it's a good policy to do, it should be able to stand on its own. You don't want to justify your policy by just saying, hey, the other guy does it, so therefore it's okay. That's a little bit like the common practice fallacy, right, that we saw last class. But in this case, you're actually referring to somebody else's action, and you're saying, well, because they do something wrong, it's okay for me to do something wrong. Or you say, here's my justification for doing it, they did it too. That's not a very good justification. If you actually do have some sort of reason for what you're doing, well, let's think about the argument. The way that they're actually saying things, they're saying X is right, and they mean right for me or right for somebody that I like. And what is their reasoning? Someone else did X. That might be one way to do it. Or somebody else did something worse than X, or somebody else did something that justifies X. Does that actually get you here? No. So again, what's got to be going on? There's got to be some sort of implicit premise, right? What would be the thing that they're assuming? Something along the lines of... Say again? Exactly. If someone else... does X, it's okay for me to do X. Or it's right, yes. So that's an implicit premise. Now, is that a true premise? Does that hold in every case, you think? Did you say yes?
What? I said no.
So you can justify anything. That was kind of surprising. Yeah, this can't hold in every case. I mean, there are some things where somebody does them, and it's good that they do it, and it's good that we do it, but Is it good just because, is it good for us to do it just because they did it? No, we should be, if it's really good, we should have some reasons. If you're justified in, say, defunding a president's pet project, whether it's the Iraq War or healthcare or anything like that, if you're right in doing that, you should have some arguments. You should have some independent claims, not just, hey, the other guys do that too. So that's a way in which people try to disqualify other people. And your book gives you some good examples. Talks about, let's say you get tired of the people upstairs stomping around late at night, probably a condition some of you have been in. They don't have to be upstairs, they might be your neighbors, they might be playing music. So to retaliate, you rent a tow truck and deposit their car in the river. I kind of like that example. It's pretty excessive, isn't it? And then, you know, when the cops come and want to know why you did that, you say, well, you know, they really ticked me off. Yeah.
What about the death penalty? Isn't that the same thing?
Yeah, your book talks about the issue of punishment. And you do want to draw a distinction. That's a good question, because you do have to draw a distinction between legitimate punishment and just going out and doing something, right? If you have some sort of process in place, like we do, where you can have access to a trial, really, if you think about it, at least in most states, the states that have executions, I'm not talking necessarily about Texas, where they do a lot of them. Generally, not too many people are being executed, and it's after very long processes of appeals, right? So you have to prove that the person really was guilty, did all these things, that the death penalty is actually merited. Then they go, sometimes they'll even go to the Supreme Court, and any sort of procedural error, that's gonna kick that out. So I wouldn't consider that too much of a problem in our case, because we have all of these processes in place. There is one problem with it, which is that in past cases, reporters and actual students have gone back and then found, evidence that somebody who's accused of a capital crime is about to be executed didn't do it. Sometimes they find DNA evidence even. But I think we're going to see less and less of those, the system screwed up cases. And a lot of times those had something to do with animosity of some sort. Now, that could be a problem for any sort of unjust political regime, right? If they don't have those sort of procedures in place. And some of the people who argue against the death penalty will bring up these sorts of arguments and say, hey, if you're for the death penalty, you're being inconsistent. For example, when I worked at Indiana State Prison, this would come up in classes. And actually, the prisoners were about half split. And that was actually a prison where they did executions. So they were quite familiar with it. The whole prison would go on lockdown. We wouldn't be allowed in to teach. And sometimes the prisoners were against the person being executed. Sometimes they were actually for it. One of the guys who ruined work release for Indiana prisoners, they wanted him executed because he screwed it up by going out and killing his wife. Now in classes, these were mostly ethics classes or religious studies classes, they would say, I don't understand how somebody could say be against abortion but be for the death penalty. And what I would actually do is I'd sit back and I'd let my students hash that out. And what was interesting, is some of the students would point out to the other ones distinctions that we could make. Right? Could you think of vital distinctions between the case of abortion and the case of inflicting the death penalty? I mean, they're both killing, right? So they have something in common. But are there vital differences?
Yes.
Yeah.
What are the differences?
A baby didn't do anything wrong.
Baby doesn't have a chance to make any choices for themselves, whereas a person on death row has made the choice to commit the crime.
So there we actually have two different distinctions. One has to do with agency, right? The person on death row, like Mr. Stone was pointing out, had some sort of agency. They had some sort of choice. And at least in this state and in Indiana where I was, somebody kills somebody in self-defense or, fit of passion, you don't put them, you don't execute them. Now, in some states they might. And in the past, we did that quite a bit. We inflicted the death penalty fairly indiscriminately. So there's one thing. The person who is being, who's on death row, they're in a different condition than a fetus, in that the fetus doesn't have any moral agency, as we say. The other thing is there's been some sort of legal procedure. Like, they've been found guilty of a crime. There's nothing like that for an abortion, right? It's not like, the mother goes to the court of law and says, I want to have an abortion, I need to find this fetus guilty so I can, inflict. I mean, this sounds absurd, doesn't it? So these are very different, aren't they? The culpability is very different. And the interesting thing is, I would sit back and let my students figure that out and hash it out with each other. And they could do it, because I think the differences in those cases are pretty easy to see.
How many fights did you have to break up?
I never had to break up any fights. This is kind of a digression. It's going to go on camera now, but I'll tell you about this. It's kind of interesting. At Indiana State Prison, Ball State had been there for 25 years. And they never had a professor in any physical danger. If an inmate ever threatened a professor, that inmate was taken out of the program. And if anybody would have harmed a professor, Ball State would have pulled out, and then you'd have had about 300 guys who would have at least one motive to go after the guy who, they took away their education. But also we would form bonds with the students. I still write to some of mine, and there was a case, for example, in Indiana there was one prison that was privatized, and that's not a very good idea to do with prisons, especially with the guards. That lends itself to trouble. Even worse, they took a bunch of Arizona prisoners and they put them in that prison. They rented out space to them. And the Arizona prisoners were allowed different privileges than the Indiana prisoners. They were actually allowed more. But the Arizona prisoners rioted. They weren't happy with their circumstances. And so there's an actual prison riot going on, right? And this is while classes were going on. So imagine there's the safe zone, there's the riot zone, and then there's where the professors are. And some of these professors are 60-year-old ladies, Well, the prisoners, they actually escorted, the Indiana prisoners, they actually escorted the professors through the riot zone, where all the crazy stuff was going on, to the safe zone. So that gives you an idea about, what was going on. I think there was a very strong appreciation of the value of education there. Actually, that could be a good example, If you have a prison education program in place, right? Indiana had a very good one. They've changed it a bit, and it's not quite so good now. North Carolina, I've actually taught in the North Carolina prison system, and I haven't been very impressed either with the DOC or with the education, because it's not very coordinated. Let's say you wanted to take away prisoners' access to education. Well, you could say, hey, they're a bunch of scumbags. They did terrible things. Therefore, we should take this away from them. Well, if you've been letting people get an education before, that's not a very good argument, is that? Because in order to be consistent, you would have had to have applied that in the past. If that was a good reason, then you would have used it before. That could be an example of two wrongs made right.
But don't you think there's too many luxuries in prison today anyway, really?
Well, it really depends on where you are. The prisons that I taught in, very few luxuries at all. And the prisons allow the ones that they have in part because it's a way of controlling the prisoners. Like, for instance, if you want to get a TV, you have to buy the TV yourself, and you can get a TV about this big and pay about $250 for it.
But why do we allow them to have TV? I mean, they're in
Well,
prison.
here's
Not
why.
them.
Here's why the administration allows them to have TV. Because it keeps them passive. If somebody's in their cell watching TV, they're not causing any trouble. TV by itself makes people passive. The administration tends to like that. And it gives them one more thing they can take away from the prisoners if the prisoners screw up. So, it's one way of enforcing good behavior. And keep in mind, too, that it costs a lot of money on the economy of scale to buy a TV. If you're making 35 cents an hour, which is what a lot of prison jobs get you, and you don't have somebody sending you money from the outside, plus you also have to pay for your own health care while you're in prison. You have a co-pay for medicine, at least in Indiana. Getting that TV, that could be like a couple of years' wages. So, it gives them something to work for. Well, you can, but,
Sort of like a token system. They
It's like
give
sending
you,
people canteen money in jail. Why? They're in jail. They don't need to buy potato chips and
They
drink.
need
They
some
give you-
freedom, just,
Well, don't break the law.
Well, if you feel strongly about that, then you should get involved in your state prison system and write letters and things like that. And again, it has to do with your state. I mean, you as a citizen of North Carolina, you got nothing to say about Indiana.
Right.
Now the federal prison system, any one of you can say anything you want about that because we're all paying for that. And actually, I would suggest any of you that do have an interest in this, do write to the North Carolina prison system. I was not highly impressed. I walked in and out of a medium security prison without being searched, except for one day an entire semester.
Wow.
I could have brought in a gun. I could have brought in
Really?
drugs. Yeah, trafficking is a huge problem in prison.
A lot of it's the guards.
Now that would not have happened in Indiana. In Indiana, I went through several different checkpoints, and I was searched at every single checkpoint. Sometimes they'd actually take us aside, and we weren't quite strip searched, but pretty close.
Really? Every day?
No. Every once in a while they'd pull you out, but we were searched every day. We'd go through an X-ray machine, sometimes drug sniffers, things like that. And you feel safer if that's the case because you know there's not a lot of stuff going on. Back to this. That was kind of a long digression. What's another case of two wrongs make a right? Think about the accusations of inconsistency that kids make to parents. Right? You've all done this. I know I have. And any of you who have kids, when your kids get old enough, they do these to you. If you tell your kids, you can't do this, but you've done it yourself, what's their response?
Well, you did it, so like that.
Yeah, either you do it, right? You're still doing it, or you did it in the past when you were my age. So how can you tell me not to do it? And what they're actually saying, they're not actually saying if it was okay for you to do it, it's okay for me. They're actually saying something like, well, you got to do something wrong, so I get to do something wrong too, aren't they? It's sort of like a trade-off, right? When I was a kid, it was smoking. Well, there were other things too, but my mom and dad and grandpa all smoked at the dinner table. And there'd just be like a cloud of smoke. And my sister and I lived with that for years. And back then people knew that smoking wasn't good for you, but they didn't really know how bad it was for you, right? About secondhand smoke and all that. This is before all those studies came out. And we just didn't like it because, it stank and it burned our eyes, and they didn't seem particularly happy with it. And then eventually my mom quit, my dad quit. They didn't actually totally quit. My dad would go and sneak cigarettes outside sometimes. And my mom actually, she continued smoking off and on through the rest of her life, usually other people's cigarettes. She would bum cigarettes. She would, they actually called her two-puff. at her job, because she would go out. This is, by that time they had cordoned off the smoking areas. Smokers, you have to go outside. So she'd go out, and she would say to these people, I don't want a cigarette. Can I just have a drag on yours? And she'd take 2 puffs, and then she'd give it back, and then she'd go back inside. She never bought her own cigarettes, never brought her own cigarettes, and yeah, at her funeral, some of her friends came up to me and said, "Yeah, your mom. We used to call your mom 2 Puff." Now, my mom got on my sister and I for smoking many, many times, and we made this exact argument to her. By the time I was 18, I was smoking. I think my sister started earlier. And then I went in the Army, and then I was really hooked because, everyone was smoking back then, and there were no taxes on the cigarettes, so you could buy them very cheaply. Well, we would always say, we would retort this: "You smoke, how can you tell us not to smoke?" "Well, I don't smoke now." "Well, you did," right? Is that a good argument to make? No, I mean, smoking is bad for you. We all know that, right? And it's good to quit smoking, and you probably shouldn't smoke. I can't think of any good reason why you should smoke. Can any of you? I mean, you can think of reasons why people do. They enjoy it. I understand that because I really liked to smoke. I love the taste. I love the feeling. You get addicted to the nicotine, but that's not a good reason, is it?
You justify your reason, but it don't make it right.
Say that again?
You justify your reason, but it doesn't make it right.
You justify your reason, but that doesn't make it right. That's a good point. And in that case, you're not really justifying your reason, are you? This is a good example of that. Somebody comes up with a reason. They did it. They did it to me. They did it to somebody else. The same thing also goes for when something bad happens to a bad person. For instance, when a thief has something stolen from them, do you say, "Well, you had it coming to you, and therefore it all sort of evened out"? Well, no, because that's, again, saying 2 wrongs make a right. If somebody let's say somebody's a chronic thief, right? That's how they make their living. But somebody steals from them, you should still do the investigation and still prosecute the other person. Just, go after the thief too, right? The original thief. You want to be consistent across the board. You don't want to just say, well, somebody was a drug dealer, so it's okay that they got killed. Or somebody, what are other cases like that? There's very little prosecution and investigation of crimes that involve prostitutes. Right? Oh, they're a prostitute. They got raped. They got killed. That's just sort of a hazard of the job. Well, that would be saying 2 wrongs make a right, wouldn't it? They deserve that to happen to them. No, if something is wrong, it's wrong. If it's okay, then again, you have to make a separate case for it. If you want to say, yeah, it's okay to kill people every once in a while, if they're the right kind of people, you've got to be able to make, that's a hard case to make, isn't it? You've got to be able to say why that's okay. It's okay for me to cheat on my taxes, because this other guy did it. Well, not a very good reason, again, either. Another good example would be, think about when people betray each other. So-and-so betrayed me, therefore it's okay for me to betray them. This happens a lot in relationships, doesn't it? Well, you cheated on me, that's why it was okay for me to cheat. Well, if cheating is wrong, then presumably it's not just wrong for that person, it's also wrong for me. And the fact that somebody else did it first doesn't make it okay for me to do. You notice something that, what's going on here? People make exceptions for themselves, don't they? They have a tendency to do this when it comes to moral reasoning. I think that's probably enough about 2 wrongs make a right. Now we're going to totally shift gears. There's another fallacy, and this one, I think, students, they grasp, but they mix up with other fallacies very easily. And the traditional name for it is a red herring. And I think it could be useful to sort of sketch out for you the metaphor that's involved. Let's say you were being pursued by bloodhounds, right? So you escaped from prison. You're on the run, and they brought the dogs out, and they're sniffing you out. They're following your trail. Right? Well, those bloodhounds are eventually going to catch you. You could go through water, any of these sorts of things. Let's say there's no creeks that you can sneak through. There is one other thing you could do. Have you ever seen that movie Cool Hand Luke?
Run on logs, run on food.
No, it's not that. Did any of you ever see that movie, first of all?
No.
Okay, it's a good movie that if you get a chance, Paul Newman, classic prison movie, he's being pursued by dogs. He actually goes into a little grocery store and he gets out, I think, cayenne and mustard and some other thing, and he sprinkles it.
Strong smell.
Yeah, well, it's not just a strong smell. Cayenne pepper, you've ever got it on your hands?
Yeah.
Imagine that up a dog's nose. The dogs, go, they're just totally out of commission. If you don't have something like that, you'd want to get them off the trail somehow, some other way. Imagine that you take something that dogs like stinky things, right? And this is why dogs will do disgusting things like roll around on dead squirrels or dead birds. You've all seen that, right? So imagine you take a really stinky thing, like a red herring. A herring is a kind of fish. And you drag that across your trail, going somewhere else. The dog, it's following you up to this point, and now it goes off in the wrong direction, and you get away. You can do something like that with arguments.
So changing the subject?
You're changing the subject, yes, but you're also kind of sticking to the same general subject. So your book has an interesting example here. Where was that? Oh no, it's not in this textbook, it's in another textbook, and I've used that when discussing it. Let's say you want to argue about abortion. Let's say you want to argue why abortion should be legal. So that's going to be your conclusion. Legal and protected, right? Now, you should be talking about abortion there, right? Not about ducks, not about, guinea pigs, not about the price of oil or anything like that. You should be talking about that subject. Not everything that you say on that subject is necessarily going to be on target, though. Let's say your reason that you give there is something like that. Just look at those mean protesters outside abortion clinics. That's about abortion. Is that relevant in any way?
Right.
No, but it might sway some people if you're not paying close attention. And you hear something like that, you say, yeah, they do say mean things, I don't like that. Therefore, abortion should be legal. That's not a reason by itself to support abortion, right? Or, let's switch the tables. Abortion should be illegal. A lot of those women getting abortions are self-centered and don't think about abortion until it's too late. Right? Yeah, I mean, there's some truth to that for some people that get abortions. You can pick any given thing, and some people are going to be self-centered, right? And a lot of people are they have no position on abortion, or sometimes they're actually against abortion until suddenly they're faced with a pregnancy crisis, and now suddenly, oh yeah, that might be the thing to do. Well, you know, again, it has to do with the subject in one way, but is it relevant? No. I mean, you could pick more innocuous examples. And it doesn't necessarily have to be all that connected to the subject. Like, let's say you wanted to make a case for why I should give you extra credit opportunities. You know, what would be some reasons that you could get? Or better yet, let's pick something not class related. We should lower your tuition. Can you come up with any good reasons for that? Besides, you know, I don't like paying tuition.
Make it more affordable for students to have to work.
Okay.
Lower the tuition so we can go more vacations or something like that.
Okay, so two good examples. One is very relevant. If you lower tuition, then you would open up education to more students, and presumably that would be a good thing, right? So that would be a relevant thing. There you'd actually be, you know, following along. So students could go on more vacations, right? Or on fancier vacations, right? Instead of staying in the crappy hotel in spring break, they could stay in the luxury hotel, right? Or something like that. Although usually the students on spring break are piled in like 5, 6 to a room, right? Okay, so would that be relevant at all to the issue of whether your tuition should be lowered? No, it would probably be reasoning that some students like, though, right? They'd go along with it, but it would be because they're not really paying attention to what's being said. They're not being critical thinkers. There's another variation on this, and your book talks about it as a smoke screen. And what is a smoke screen? Well, that doesn't have to do so much with the technique that you're using. It has to do with the quantity. Your book calls a smoke screen when a person just throws a whole bunch of things at you. And some of them may be, you know, connected, some of them may not. You know some people argue like this, right? You ask them, why do you think this is the case? And they just keep talking. And after a while you have to say, hey, shut up. I want to think about this. You know, and then you start thinking about what the things that they're saying, are they actually connected sometimes? Nah. Some of them may actually be relevant, but the technique of smoke screen is just to throw a whole bunch of different considerations at you, tangentially related to the subject. Some of them may in fact be relevant, but you won't know that until you sift through them. And they're not offering you the chance to sift through them. They're just hitting you with a lot of verbiage. That's a manipulative technique. As a matter of fact, people do this deliberately. They sometimes... say again? Telemarketers. That's a good example. I hadn't thought of that. When you get a telemarketer and they're good at their job, they're not just the person who you can tell is just reading a script and is, you know, hasn't done it very much, but they're a good salesperson, they're able to hit you with a pattern. You find yourself having a hard time, as we say, getting a word in edgewise. You're familiar? You've all had that sort of experience with telemarketers? Or with other salespeople? They're probably doing this technique of smokescreen. They're saying a lot of things, some of which may be relevant, most of which probably isn't, and it's all just jumbled up together. Like it says, generally speaking, red herrings distract by pulling one's attention away from one topic and toward another, or from one aspect of the topic towards another. Smoke screens tend to pile issues on or make them extremely complicated until the original gets lost in the verbal smoke. And I think you guys have had experiences of that as well. Sometimes somebody says so much that you forget what the point was they were trying to make in the first place. And then if they really want to get you, you know what they do at the end of it? They say, so, all of this goes to show, and here's your point, right? You say, I didn't follow the whole argument, But yeah, that sounds reasonable. You gave a whole bunch of reasons and facts, you know. Another reason people get taken in by this, if you throw a lot of complicated verbiage at somebody and they are not able to follow it, it could be because it's so tangled and it's illogical that nobody could follow it, right? But how do ordinary people feel about that sort of thing? How do they feel about their capacity to understand arguments? Most people don't want to come out and say, I didn't understand what you said. Do they? Because what do they feel? Stupid or ashamed or...
Slow.
What's that?
Slow.
Slow? Yeah. And people don't want to admit that. We've talked about this before, bless it, with the emotions, just Monday, right? So if you know that people are already prone to going along with things, if you throw a lot of stuff at them and it's not necessarily connected, if you know that people will probably not question you because they don't want to appear stupid, then you can manipulate them. And there's people out there who do this. So that is where we're going to leave off. You notice that we're done with chapter 6. We're moving into chapter 7. And chapter 7 is full of more fallacies. Some of these are organized like the other ones we talked about into families. Others are going to be less connected with each other. And all of them have some sort of structure though, that we can point to and say, this is what makes this fallacy what it is. So I'll see all of you Monday. Have a good weekend.